In our past video, we have focused on the Tiandihui, the tin mining in Larut, the Haisan secret society, and their leader, Kapitan Gina Chung Keng Kui. In today's video, we are going to shift our focus and look at the Haisan's main adversary. Hello everybody, my name is Timothy and I want to welcome you to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to focus on the Ghee Hin, which is the Haisan's main adversary, and you can consider them as Haisan's main rival. But who they are, what is it about them? So much less is written about the Ghee Hin compared to the Haisan, and yet their story and their history is no less remarkable. And so, without further ado, let's dive right in on the story of the Ghee Hin. Prologue, the Hidden Brotherhood. In the teeming port cities and rugged mining frontier of 19th century Malaya, a secret world flourished in the shadows. Beneath the British colonial order, out of sight of European officials and native rulers, Chinese brotherhoods bound by oaths, rituals, and blood ties offered protection, justice, and sometimes vengeance. Among the most feared and influential of these was the Ghee Hin Society, known in Mandarin as義興公司and Hokkien as Ghee Hin Kongsi, the company of righteousness and prosperity. It was more than a gang. To its members, the Ghee Hin was a surrogate family, a sanctuary in a foreign land, and a cause worth killing and dying for. Its origins lay not in Malaya, but in the soil of southern China, where the ideals of the Tiandihui, a secret anti-Qing movement, had long inspired resistance against imperial oppression. When waves of Chinese immigrants sailed to Southeast Asia in search of fortune, they brought with them not only memories of home, but also the underground networks that had once defied the Qing. On Penang Island and the strait ports of Singapore and Malacca, the Ghee Hin took root. They swore loyalty to each other before heaven and earth, performed arcane rites in candlelit halls, and took up arms when honor, territory, and survival demanded it. But over time, noble aspirations gave way to bitter rivalries with other secret societies, with colonial authorities, and sometimes among themselves. The Ghee Hin would become both a protector of the Chinese people and a source of bloodshed. This is the story of how an idealistic brotherhood rose to prominence in the Chinese diaspora, how it shaped the political and social life of early Malaya, and how it eventually fell, shattered by colonial suppression and the weight of its own contradictions. Chapter 1, Origins in China. To understand the Ghee Hin, one must begin not in Malaya, but in the heart of southern China during a time of dynastic decay and social unrest. It was the mid-Qing dynasty, a period marked by corruption, famine, and foreign encroachment. Among the disillusioned Han Chinese, resentment simmered under the surface, resentment against the Manchu rulers who had seized the throne in the 17th century and continued to rule with a heavy hand. From this soil of discontent emerged the Tiandihui, the Heaven and Earth Society. Founded in the late 17th or early 18th century, the Tiandihui was part underground resistance, part spiritual brotherhood. It espoused a mission both political and metaphysical to Fan Qing Fu Ming, overthrow the Qing and restore the Ming. Yet the Tiandihui was not a single organization, but rather a loose network of secret societies, each with its own leadership and interpretation of the Brotherhood's goals. Its ideals blended Confucian loyalty, Taoist cosmology, and Buddhist ritual, forming a potent spiritual political force that attracted peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and even scholars. Members performed secret ceremonies, swore blood oaths of loyalty, and believed they were part of a divine mission to right historical wrongs. By the early 19th century, this society had spread far beyond China's borders, carried by migrants seeking escape from poverty and persecution. As Chinese communities took root in Southeast Asia, so too did their secret brotherhoods. In this new frontier, the ideals of Tiandihui were adapted to local needs. The Ghee Hin Society, established in the Straits settlements, was born of this legacy. Its members may have spoken different dialects, Hokkien, Hainanese, Teochew, but they were united by the Tiandihui's vision of righteousness, solidarity, and resistance. The Ghee Hin would become one of the most powerful expressions of this tradition in the Nanyang. Chapter 2: Crossing the South Seas. In the early 19th century, the South China Sea became a lifeline of desperation and hope. Driven by famine, war, overpopulation, and Qing repression, tens of thousands of Chinese left their ancestral villages and sailed for the Nanyang, the southern seas. Among the destinations that beckoned were the Straits settlements, Penang, Singapore, and Malacca. There, the British offered commercial opportunity, and Chinese merchants offered kingship, jobs, and shelter. But for many migrants, the journey was only the beginning of their struggle. They arrived penniless, unable to speak the local dialects, vulnerable to exploitation by employers, middlemen, and even fellow Chinese. In this environment of uncertainty, secret societies offered a sense of belonging, a shield against the unknown, and a sword when threatened. It was amidst this flux that the Ghee Hin Society emerged. Scholars believe it was first established around 1820 or 1821, likely in Penang, one of the earliest British footholds in the region and a hub for Chinese migration. Its name, Righteousness and Prosperity Company, was both a promise and a purpose. The Ghee Hin was conceived as a fraternal association based on mutual protection, justice, and self-help, grounded in the ritualistic traditions of the Tiandihui. Unlike the more centralized organizations that would follow, the Ghee Hin operated as a federation of lodges or hui, spread across the straits. From Penang, the society expanded to Singapore, where it established a stronghold in the 1830s, and to Malacca, Perak, and Johor, adapting to the local circumstances of each settlement. Leadership was often fluid, chosen by election or consensus among senior members, and branches were linked by messengers and ritual correspondence rather than formal hierarchy. Over time, the Ghee Hin became known not only for its solidarity but also for its militant posture. As tensions rose between different dialect groups and rival societies, the Ghee Hin stood ready to defend its members, sometimes through negotiations, often through force. In this new land, the ideals of the Tiandihui had taken on a life of their own. The Ghee Hin was no longer just an offshoot of a Chinese movement, it had become a local power in its own right, rooted in the lived experience of the Chinese diaspora in British Malaya. Chapter 3: Oaths, Rituals and Brotherhood. Behind closed doors and bamboo screens, far from the eyes of British officials, the Ghee Hin conducted ceremonies steeped in mystery and tradition. Membership was not given lightly, it had to be earned through ritual, secrecy and solemn oath. Those who joined did not merely become members of a society, they were bound into a brotherhood that claimed sacred legitimacy and spiritual depth. The Ghee Hin followed the elaborate ritual structure of the Tiandihui with strong Taoist and Buddhist overtones. Initiation ceremonies were theatrical, symbolic, and deeply hierarchical. They often took place in candlelit chambers decorated with altars, incense, and sacred texts. Symbols like the heaven and earth, the five ancestors, and the Peach Garden Oath, referencing the legendary brotherhood of Liu Bei, Guan Yu, and Zhang Fei, were invoked to elevate the proceedings. New recruits swore to uphold righteousness, obey their elders, and aid their brothers in life and death. Their vows were sealed with offerings of wine and blood, and they were taught secret passwords, hand gestures, coded songs, and poetic couplets. These were more than ritualistic pageantry. They were tools for recognition and security, vital in a world where betrayal could mean death. The Ghee Hin was divided into lodges or halls, each with its own headman, stewards and enforcers. Positions bore name reminiscence of imperial bureaucracy or classical Chinese novels. Terms like incense master, hall leader, or red staff. Communication between branches relied on coded documents and oral relays. In some cases, elaborate paper charms and symbolic diagrams were used to convey secret messages. The society also recognized a lineage of 5 ancestral clans, traditionally said to be the Li, Zhao, Zhang, Liu, and Wen families, though these were symbolic rather than literal kin groups. Each member was ritually assigned to one of these clans, reinforcing the sense of familial identity within the society. This inner world of ceremony and structure gave the Ghee Hin its strength. It fosters deep loyalty, a shared moral compass, and an identity rooted in Chinese tradition and anchored in the foreign land of the Nanyang. But this same structure also made the societies difficult to control and opaque to outsiders, especially to the British, who saw in it only danger and subversion. Chapter 4: Early Leadership and Influence. In the formative decades of the Ghee Hin's presence in the Strait settlements, leadership did not rest in a single central figure. Instead, authority flowed through respected elders, chosen for their charisma, wisdom, and connections, men who could command loyalty, resolve disputes, and rally support when the society's interests were under threat. The identities of the early leaders are difficult to pin down with certainty. Secret societies operated in the shadows, leaving few written records. What we do know is that figures like Lo Kuan, said to have been an early Ghee Hin headman in Singapore, played a central role in shaping the society's growth beyond Penang. Lo Kuan is remembered in some accounts as both a protector of the Chinese community and a man capable of ruthless action when crossed. His leadership reflected the paradox that defined the Ghee Hin itself: benevolence within, aggression without. These early leaders were often merchants, moneylenders, or Hokkien with strong ties to local Chinese networks. Their power derived not just from ritual position, but from the ability to provide resources and protection to newcomers, laborers, and small traders. In a colonial world where Chinese immigrants had little recourse to the British legal system, it was these men, the society they led, that filled the void. Leadership was often shaped by the dialect and clan division among Chinese migrants. The Ghee Hin, though multi-dialect in theory, tended to attract Hokkiens, Hainanese, and Teochews, while Cantonese and Hakkas were more likely to join rival societies. This gave Ghee Hin leaders influence in certain migrant enclaves, but also made them competitors in an increasingly fractured Chinese landscape. In towns like Penang and Singapore, the Ghee Hin became a parallel power structure. Their elders could broker truces between rival groups, settle debts, or even decide the fate of a man accused of betrayal. They could also command small armies of society members, coolies, tin miners, shopkeepers, ready to wield cleavers and bamboo spears at a moment's notice. Though not all Ghee Hin leaders sought violence, the threat of force was always implicit. Their influence extended from temple courtyards to back alley opium dens, from clan halls to secret shrines. In the vacuum left by colonial neglect and legal alienation, the Ghee Hin's early leadership gave voice and muscle to a growing restless community. Chapter 5: Guardians of the People. While the name secret society often conjures images of violence and conspiracy, the Ghee Hin was also deeply embedded in the daily life of Chinese immigrants. For many in the diaspora, the society was not a gang, but a guardian. In a foreign land where colonial institutions offered little protection, the Ghee Hin provided welfare, solidarity, and justice. Newly arrived immigrants, many of them young men from Fujian or Hainan, were particularly vulnerable. They disembarked from crowded ships with few possessions, no knowledge of local languages, and no legal standing under British rule. The Ghee Hin filled that void. Its members helped newcomers find lodging, jobs, and food, often arranging employment in plantations, docks, and tin mines. In some cases, they paid off brokers and middlemen who had placed migrants under oppressive debt bondage. The Ghee Hin also played a central role in dispute resolution. When quarrels broke out over wages, debts, or land, members did not turn to colonial courts, where proceedings were conducted in English and often biased in favor of Europeans. Instead, they went to the society elders, who convened informal tribunals, heard both sides, and passed judgment based on Chinese customs and ethical codes. These decisions were generally respected, enforced by the society's reputation and its willingness to back up rulings with force if necessary. Funerary rites were another aspect of the Ghee Hin's role. In a world where death in a foreign land could mean an unmarked grave, the society ensured that its members received proper burials. It maintained graveyards, organized mourning rituals, and arranged for remains to be sent back to China when possible. To die as a Ghee Hin member was to die among brothers. The society also contributed to religious and community life. Ghee Hin members supported temples, sponsored festivals, and held ceremonies in honor of Chinese deities, particularly Tua Pek Kong and Quan Ti, the god of war and brotherhood. These activities strengthened the community's cultural identity and lent the society a veneer of legitimacy and respectability. Even as the British began to view secret society with suspicion, many of the Chinese community saw the Ghee Hin not as criminals, but as defenders of order and guardians of their welfare. It was this dual character, protector and enforcer, benefactor and brother, that made the Ghee Hin both influential and feared. Chapter 6: Rising Tensions with the Haisan. As Chinese secret societies spread across the Malay Peninsula, the early spirit of solidarity began to splinter. Dialect divisions, economic rivalries, and clan loyalties led to growing competition among societies that once claimed a common heritage in the Tiandihui tradition. Chief among the Ghee Hin's rivals was the formidable Haisan society. The Haisan, like the Ghee Hin, was a Tiandihui offshoot, but where the Ghee Hin drew its strength from Hokkien, Hainanese, and Teochew migrants, the Haisan was dominated by Cantonese and Hakka. In the tin-rich territories of Perak, this ethnic division translated into rival spheres of influence and inevitably into violent confrontation. Initially, the two societies coexisted uneasily, staking out their domains in the mining districts of Taiping, Kamunting, and the surrounding Kinta Valley. Each society operated its own system of protection, labor recruitment, taxation, and dispute resolution. But as tin exports surged and new seams were discovered, the stakes grew higher. Disputes over mining claims, control of labor, and customs duties sparked skirmishes that quickly escalated into open warfare. At the heart of the rivalry were different visions of power. The Ghee Hin, rooted in Penang and older Straits Chinese networks, tended to be more decentralized and ideologically grounded in Tiandihui values. The Haisan, on the other hand, were more commercially focused, backed by powerful Cantonese Hokkien and increasingly linked to British-aligned local officials. Between the 1850s and 1870s, the rivalry exploded into what became known as the Larut Wars, a series of bloody conflicts fought across the Perak tin fields. Though these wars will be explored in greater detail later, it is important to note here that the Ghee Hin's feud with the Haisan marked a turning point, from secret society as guardians to secret society as warlord. This chapter of hostility also eroded the Ghee Hin's moral authority. No longer viewed by the British merely as a self-help society, the Ghee Hin was increasingly seen as a destabilizing force, a militia cloaked in ritual, as capable of arson and assassination as it was of community support. The rivalry with the Haisan was not merely about business or ethnicity. It was a struggle for dominance in a world where the state was weak, the frontier lawless, and the only justice came from the barrel of a musket or the blade of a broadsword. Chapter 7: The Penang Riots of 1867. In the sweltering month of August 1867, the streets of Georgetown, Penang exploded into violence. For 4 chaotic days, fire, gunpowder, and bamboo cannons turned the heart of the city into a war zone. At the center of the bloodshed stood 2 rival Chinese secret societies, the Ghee Hin Kongsi and the Tua Pekong Society. Unlike the Haisan Ghee Hin rivalry in the tin fields of Perak, the Penang conflict was an intra-Hokkien Cantonese struggle that reflected deeper dialect divisions within the Chinese community. By the 1860s, the Ghee Hin in Penang was largely dominated by Cantonese-speaking migrants from Guangdong, though it still counted Hokkien, Teochew, and Hakka members in its ranks. The Tuapekong society, by contrast, was overwhelmingly Hokkien, with strong roots in the mercantile and shipping networks of Georgetown. Tensions between the two groups had been simmering for years over gambling farms, street control, and personal rivalries, but in 1867 they finally boiled over. The immediate spark was widely reported as a dispute over a funeral procession, yet local oral tradition added a more colourful twist, that it all began when someone tossed a rambutan skin at a member of the rival society, an insult that escalated beyond control. Historians have found no documentary evidence for the rambutan story, and most regard it as a piece of folklore rather than fact, but it survives as a vivid example of how something trivial could ignite a city already on edge. When fighting erupted, it spread with terrifying speed. Society members barricaded streets, torched rival clan houses, and opened fire from rooftops with muskets and bamboo cannons. The Tuapekong society, entrenched at their headquarters in the Tuapekong Temple on Armenian Street, fortified the surrounding streets into a defensive stronghold. The Ghee Hin, operating from their own bases further inland in the Cantonese Quarter near Beach Street and adjoining lanes, launched coordinated assaults on the Tuapekong's positions. Ordinary residents were trapped indoors as the two sides exchanged fire and as blazes consumed rows of shophouses. The British authorities, caught off guard, scrambled to restore order. Troops were deployed, Marines landed from nearby ships, and Governor Archibald Anson declared a state of emergency. After 4 days, order was restored, but at great cost. Over 100 buildings destroyed, dozens killed or wounded, and hundreds arrested or deported. For the Ghee Hin, the riots were both a demonstration of their fighting strength and a strategic misstep. They had proven their capacity for rapid mobilization, but had also made themselves a prime target for colonial suppression. I will be devoting a separate video to the Penang Riots of 1867, where I will unpack the full sequence of events, share what oral histories recall, and explore what historians and scholarly works have concluded about this dramatic episode in Penang's past. Chapter 8: War in the Tin Fields. While the Penang Riots shocked the colonial authorities in the Strait settlements, an even bloodier struggle was unfolding to the south in the tin-rich district of Larut, Perak. There, the Ghee Hin and the Hisans were locked in a protracted, brutal conflict over control of the tin mines, trade routes, and political alliances. These clashes would come to be known collectively as the Larut Wars, a series of 4 major outbreaks of violence between the 1860s and 1870s that shaped the future of Perak and British Malaya. The Larut region had become a magnet for Chinese labor, driven by the global demand for tin. Powerful Chinese Kongsi societies took root in the mining towns, forming parallel systems of governance. The Ghee Hin, backed by Hokkien and Hainanese interests, aligned itself with certain Malay chiefs, while the Hisan, with its Cantonese and Hakka base, was closely tied to the influential figure of Chung Keng Kui. I have done the full story of the Larut Wars in a separate video, and I will place a link to it in the description for those who wish to explore that dramatic conflict in depth. There is also a separate video on Kapitan Chung Keng Kui, and the link is also in the description. Initially, the Ghee Hin held the upper hand in parts of the Larut Valley, particularly in Klian Pao, which is known today as Taiping. But as competition intensified, disputes over labor recruitment, gambling farms, and access to waterways ignited repeated outbreaks of violence. Mines were flooded, villages burnt, and caravans ambushed. What began as gang warfare evolved into something close to a civil war. The first Larut War in 1861 was triggered by accusation of theft and retaliation between the two societies. The second war in 1865 escalated over control of a key mining area, and the third in 1871 saw the Ghee Hin launching a failed attack on Haisan positions. The final conflict, the Fourth Larut War of 1873-74, was the most devastating. Armed with imported weapons and acting like private armies, both societies devastated the Larut countryside. Caught in the middle were the Malay rulers. Local chiefs like Nga Ibrahim tried to arbitrate but were often drawn into the conflict. The Ghee Hin's alliance with rival Malay factions only deepened the instability. Eventually, the violence became so uncontrollable that the British, who had previously maintained a hands-off policy, intervened. The Larut Wars culminated in the Pangkor Treaty of 1874, which imposed British residency over Perak and marked the beginning of formal British intervention in the Malay states. In this way, the Ghee Hin's role in the Larut conflict had an unintended consequence. It accelerated colonial expansion. Though the Ghee Hin fought for survival and supremacy, it also fought for a world that was slipping away. The old order of secret societies, autonomous kongsis, and migrant brotherhoods was being replaced by a new colonial structure, one that had no place for an armed independent Chinese society. Chapter 9: British Crackdown and Colonial Anxiety. By the 1870s, British colonial authorities could no longer ignore the disruptive power of the Chinese secret societies. The Penang Riots had revealed their capacity for urban violence. The Larut Wars had drawn the Strait settlements into the political turmoil of the Malay states. And at the center of it all stood organizations like the Ghee Hin, now seen not as mutual aid societies, but as dangerous, destabilizing militias. For much of the early 19th century, the British had adopted a policy of indirect tolerance. They recognized that secret societies perform essential social functions, providing order, welfare, and dispute resolution within the Chinese community. But as the scale of violence grew, especially in tin mining territories and urban centers, so too did the colonial anxiety. The Ghee Hin, once quietly tolerated, now became the object of intense surveillance and control. British administrators began to compile intelligence reports on society leaders, gathering names, tracking lodge locations, and infiltrating meetings where possible. Translators and Chinese informants were employed to decode secret documents, monitor rumors, and advise on the movements of known society figures. In Penang, Singapore, and Perak, police raids on suspected Ghee Hin lodges became more frequent. Public discourse, especially in the English language press, turned sharply against the societies. Editorials called them nests of treason, and colonial officers described them as states within a state. The Ghee Hin, with its martial history, intricate hierarchy, and code of silence, became the focal point of these fears. The colonial response was not limited to surveillance. Beginning in the 1870s, new legislation was passed to curtail secret society activities. Licensing requirements were tightened for Chinese organizations. public meetings were restricted, weapons ownership among Chinese residents was more closely monitored. Non-Ghee Hin members could be arrested under vague charges of unlawful assembly or inciting public disorder. At the same time, the colonial government began to cultivate alternative power structures. Wealthy Chinese businessmen who opposed the secret societies were elevated as community leaders, often appointed as Kapitan Cina or members of new municipal councils. These elites, in turn, were expected to discourage secret society activities and support colonial policing efforts. Still, the crackdown was not immediate or total. The Ghee Hin continued to operate, though more cautiously, in both Peninsular Malaya and Singapore. Its leadership grew more secretive, its operations more fragmented. But the writing was on the wall. The society was no longer growing, it was under siege. Its influence eroded by a state determined to impose law and order on its own terms. Chapter 10: Decline from Within. By the late 19th century, the Ghee Hin secret society was no longer the formidable force it had once been. Besieged from without by colonial surveillance and legal restrictions, it now faced a different threat: decline from within. The society that had once united thousands of Chinese immigrants under a common banner of brotherhood and mutual aid was slowly unraveling, undone by internal divisions, shifting demographics, and the changing realities of a modernizing Malaya. A major challenge was fragmentation. As British laws restricted open activity, the once centralized Ghee Hin began to break into smaller, semi-autonomous lodges across Penang, Singapore, Malacca, and the Malay states. Without a unified command, discipline broke down. Some branches grew more criminal in nature, focusing on gambling, extortion, and turf wars, while others clung to the original ideals of mutual welfare and moral conduct. The public image of the Ghee Hin became increasingly blurred. Were they righteous protectors or predatory gangsters? Leadership disputes further weakened the society. With no officially recognized structure, rival factions began to vie for influence. The absence of charismatic national figures, unlike the Haisans which rallied around men like Chung Keng Kui, left the Ghee Hin without a coherent direction. Local lodge heads sometimes defied orders or withheld funds. Others defected altogether, either to rival groups or to pursue personal gains in the new colonial economy. Perhaps most damaging of all was the erosion of public trust. Among the Chinese merchant class, especially the rising Straits Chinese elite, secret societies were increasingly viewed as backward and dangerous. British authorities too encouraged this sentiment by rewarding cooperation and discouraging society affiliations. The Ghee Hin, once a symbol of solidarity and resistance, was now associated with violence, secrecy, and social disruption. Compounding this decline was the changing nature of Chinese migration. By the 1880s and 1890s, new arrivals to Malaya were less inclined to join secret societies. The colonial government's expanding administrative machinery, municipal services, and Chinese protectorates offered other forms of support. For many immigrants, registering with the authorities or joining a trade guild became more practical and safer than pledging loyalty to a society under constant threat. In a bitter irony, the very success of the early Ghee Hin in organizing migrants and asserting influence had made them indispensable in their time. But now, that same assertiveness had turned them into a liability. Disconnected from the new social order, fragmented in leadership, and mistrusted by both officials and the emerging Chinese elite, the Ghee Hin was no longer a rising force. It was a fading relic of an older, more turbulent age. Chapter 11: The Final Blow. The final blow to the Ghee Hin secret society came not with a dramatic confrontation, but through the slow tightening of the colonial noose. After decades of watching the secret societies clash and destabilize the region, the British resolved to eliminate them completely from the social fabric of Malaya and the Strait settlements. The Ghee Hin, long regarded as the most widespread and defiant of them all, was to be the primary target. The legal instrument of choice was the Society's Ordinance of 1887, passed in Singapore and later extended to the Federated Malay States. This law granted the colonial government sweeping powers to ban any society deemed dangerous to public peace and to prosecute those who administered, joined, or even supported them. The law did not name the Ghee Hin explicitly, but everyone understood its intended purpose. This was followed by the establishment of the Chinese Protectorate, a colonial institution tasked with managing Chinese affairs, offering dispute resolution, and protecting the welfare of new immigrants, functions that had once been monopolized by secret societies. The Protectorate, backed by police powers, swiftly moved to register migrants, monitor clan associations, and discourage lodge activity. Ghee Hin lodges that had gone underground were now exposed and their members brought under scrutiny. In Penang and Singapore, coordinated police raids were carried out on suspected Ghee Hin premises. Ritual objects, membership records, and secret insignia were seized. Society leaders were arrested and, in many cases, deported to China under the pretext of maintaining public order. Others were tried for various offences, from illegal assembly to extortion, and given harsh sentences to send a clear message. Surveillance became relentless. Even those suspected of past affiliation were subject to interrogation and intimidation. The suppression was also psychological. The British launched a propaganda campaign against secret societies, portraying them as violent, immoral, and anti-modern. This resonated with the Straits Chinese elite and younger generations who were increasingly drawn to Western education, Christian missions, and new professional opportunities under British rule. Society membership plummeted. The oath-bound brotherhoods, once powerful and proud, were now widely viewed as outdated and disreputable. By the early 1900s, the Ghee Hin was effectively dismantled. Its branches had either disbanded or gone dormant. The name itself faded from the newspapers, its once fierce presence reduced to whispers in Chinatown alleys and stories passed down among the elderly. The brotherhood that had shaped the destinies of so many Chinese immigrants in the 19th century, organizing their labor, fighting their battles, and guiding their loyalties, was no more. Yet the Ghee Hin did not disappear entirely. Its legacy lingered in the memories of old coolies, the architecture of abandoned lodges, and in the colonial records that meticulously documented its rise and fall. The society's demise marked not just the end of an organization, but the closing chapter of an era, a time when Chinese men, far from home, bound themselves to secret oaths in search of meaning, protection, and power in a foreign land. Chapter 12 Shadows of the Past. Though the Ghee Hin secret society was formally dismantled in the early 20th century, its legacy continues to cast a long, complex shadow over the history of Malaya and Singapore. Today, it is remembered with a mix of fascination, fear, and ambiguity. Part patriotic brotherhood, part criminal underworld, and part cultural enigma. In official histories written during the British colonial period, the Ghee Hin was often portrayed as a lawless menace. Colonial administrators describe it as a breeding ground for violence, extortion, and rebellion. In this telling, its suppression was necessary to impose peace and modern governance. But this narrative oversimplifies the society's deeper roots and purposes. The Ghee Hin was not created of a desire for chaos. It was born for necessity, from the isolation, exploitation, and vulnerability that early Chinese migrants faced in Southeast Asia. For many of those migrants, the Ghee Hin offered the only semblance of community and structure. It provided shelter, jobs, legal representation, and even funeral arrangements. Its rituals and ceremonies gave spiritual comfort, and its code of brotherhood instilled a sense of belonging in a foreign land. For all its flaws, the Ghee Hin was a pillar of survival for thousands who had no other support. Over time, the society's legacy became romanticized in some quarters. In oral histories and popular imagination, Ghee Hin members are sometimes remembered as noble fighters for justice, defenders of the weak, and proto-nationalists who resisted British domination. The society's connection to the Tiandihui, the legendary Heaven and Earth Society in China, added an aura of revolutionary mystique. Some believe, or wanted to believe, that the Ghee Hin had deeper links to anti-Qing resistance and Chinese nationalism. Yet such interpretations must be approached with care. The Ghee Hin was not a monolith. Its chapters across the peninsula varied widely in character. Some indeed focused on welfare and justice, while others devolved into violence and self-interest. There were heroes among them, but also opportunists. Like any large organization, it reflected the complexities of the people within it and the times in which they lived. Today, little physical trace remains of the Ghee Hin. The society's meeting halls, once hidden in plain sight behind shophouses or nestled within remote villages, have been demolished or repurposed. Few descendants openly speak of ancestral connections to the society. Its secretive nature and later criminal associations have left a lingering taboo. Yet its influence lingers in less obvious ways. In the clan associations that replace it, in the linguistic remnants of its codes and ranks, and in the broader story of how the Chinese community adapted to life in colonial Malaya. In the end, the Ghee Hin was a product of its time, a time of uncertainty, upheaval, and survival. Its legacy is neither entirely noble nor entirely shameful. It is a story that must be told in full with all its contradictions intact to understand how the Chinese diaspora navigated a strange and often hostile world and how they forged solidarity in the shadows. Epilogue: Remembering Brotherhood in the Shadows. The story of the Ghee Hin secret society was more than a tale of blood oaths and clandestine rituals. It is the story of a people trying to make sense of dislocation, exploitation, and survival in a world that offered them little protection. For the Chinese migrants who arrived in 19th century Malaya and Singapore, the Ghee Hin was not simply a gang. It was, for many, the closest thing to a family. In an age before colonial law reached the streets of Chinese settlements, and before clan associations and temples were strong enough to organize communal life, secret societies filled the void. The Ghee Hin built informal systems of justice, offered mutual aid, and shaped the social landscape in ways both profound and problematic. Its influence was everywhere, in the tin mines of Perak, the port towns of Penang, the alleys of Singapore. Yet the very structure that allowed it to flourish also sowed the seeds of its downfall. Its secrecy bred suspicion. Its rituals alienated outsiders, and its forays into violence, often in bitter conflict with the Haisan and other rivals, brought increasing scrutiny from the colonial state. In time, the Ghee Hin could no longer withstand the pressure. It fragmented, faded, and was eventually outlawed. But the Ghee Hin did not disappear without leaving its imprint. The organization helped shape the contours of Chinese identity in Southeast Asia. It showed how community could be constructed from hardship and how solidarity could emerge even when cloaked in secrecy and shadow. It paved the way, in some respects, to more formal institutions, clan associations, Chinese chambers of commerce, and temple societies that took over many of its social functions as the colonial world changed. Today, the name Ghee Hin stirs curiosity, caution, and even pride. It reminds us that history is rarely clean-cut. Beneath the stereotypes of gangsters and outlaws lies a deeper narrative of resistance, adaptation, and resilience. In telling this story, we are not glorifying the past, but we are honoring its complexity. The Ghee Hin secret society is gone, but its legacy lives on in stories passed down, in the foundations of communities built long ago, and in the enduring question, how do we care for one another in times of chaos? Thanks for joining me in learning about the Ghee Hin society. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to give it a like and subscribe to the Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel for more videos like this as we take paths into the past. Until we meet again, this is Timothy signing off. Kam salut, Cici.